thank you very much. Wow, there's quite a few of you. Good morning, everyone. I should add that alongside my work at Arup, I'm a poet, and so if you don't mind, you'll be receiving a little bit of poetry this morning. It's just a thing for 8 o'clock in the morning, but I know. Bear with me. You're still half asleep, and the bloke at the front starts waxing lyrical. But there is a method here. Poetry and buildings can sit comfortably together, and I'm far from being the first person to try and combine them. So why do I write this stuff? Well, I'm fascinated by cities and all their chaos and clutter, how places can trigger thoughts and stories and form strange connections, how architecture can rhyme, echo and clash. Poetry has always seemed to me to be a really good way of exploring and representing these ambiguous effects. And I hope you can hear a bit of this in what I have to say to you today. I'll just read a few snippets here and there. And look, I'm going to make it really clear when it's coming up. I'm going to start with a full one, though, just to set the scene. It concerns some nagging doubts about modernism and what has been lost in the name of progress. This is called A Momentum of Their Own. We've sent a Catherine wheel's worth of particles colliding, curling, spinning out and splitting, growing all the time in entropy and volume and velocity. They blast away old ornament and, scourging every symbol, every surface, gloss and flatten all proportion. Incandescent, they propel themselves to heights we'd never dreamed of, make us nervous motion, keep us listless, fidgeting in doubt, without a buttress for our boyish trust in things. So let's establish a perspective. William Shakespeare famously said that all the world's a stage. I'd like to break that down a bit, concentrating less on the different scenes of a life, from birth to childhood and so on, and more on the theatrical setting which frames and surrounds the action. We're going to start on a global scale and work down. So I read an article recently which compared the so-called brand value of the world's major cities. And the idea of a city brand was interesting, I suppose. But what really struck me about the article was the photography. So many of the cities were represented by these amazingly cinematic images, these vast, twinkling, crusted landscapes, the towers kind of clustered together like geological features, always at dusk. The scale and the sweep of each of the images was quite incredible. But it struck me that none of them really portrayed the experience of actually being in that place. The brand image of many cities, it seems, is the aerial view, and that's a world away from the man on the street. These images lodge in our minds, but do we ever actually see them, these viewpoints, for ourselves? Guidebooks tend to agree that walking is the best way to get to know a city. There's something about the pace and security of the stroll that allows the senses to be activated and the city to be absorbed to its fullest degree. I walk a lot. I love it. And as I pace through the city, all of this sweeping mass of architecture, this brand image, is reduced down to the street that I'm on. The towers are there, for sure, but they are in the distance, abstracted by that distance. What is sensed most clearly, in most detail, is what is right here, just meters away. In this context, I'm taking the role of a citizen. So I'm no longer a passenger in the helicopter looking down from above, and neither am I inside the building looking out. I'm outside in the open air, on the street at ground level, and maybe you're walking with me. So how then do we experience the buildings around us? As a sequence of facades. So think about it. How many of the doors that you ever pass by do you ever go through? The number of buildings we ever actually enter is very small indeed. In previous talks, we've covered floor plans and basements, plant rooms and lift cores. From this month's perspective, facades dominate our appreciation of architecture. We can feel their textures, gauge their proportions relative to our own, and invest meanings in their smallest details and decoration. Okay, so here's my premise. The street is a stage. The facade is the scenery. We are the cast. Are we designing our buildings for the good of the play? A brief word about transparency. Above all else, the facade is a surface. There are many ways of constructing it and many different materials to choose from. The prevailing trend is for glazed curtain wall systems, and I'd like to talk for a moment about these. The orthodoxy of modernism, still very much a mainstream belief today, demands that the function of a building is expressed in its form and legible in its facade. The development of this thinking has led us to full glass facades, which, as the writer Richard Sennett describes, allow the inside and the outside of a building to be dissolved, achieving the ultimate invisibility. So this keys into a basic principle of life today, whereby everything is shared in public, all of our actions and innermost feelings on public display. At face value, I think we can all find this notion quite attractive. The idea of public and private realms blending together into a shared arena of friendly informality. And in any case, what have we got to hide? Glass, however, is a bit of a complex thing. For one, it can exaggerate a feeling of separation. Sennett goes on to describe how glass walls, for all their transparency, become hermetic barriers, isolating the activities within the building from the life of the street. And this sounds quite familiar to me. As we walk past a building, we might see a dinner party or an office meeting, but we're still fundamentally excluded, despite the design of the facade implying that somehow we're all sharing the same space. There's something vaguely fraudulent about this. However visible it might be, the private space inside a building is fundamentally different from the public space outside. And remember, our perspective here is that of a citizen, not an occupant. We're outside looking in, and maybe we don't want to see everything. It's not that we don't care what happens inside, it's just that in many cases we might be quite happy using our imaginations instead. Nothing quite fires up the human brain like mystery, and for that we need some things to be hidden. Clearly there are occasions when visibility and glass barriers are great assets. Shops are an obvious example, and I'm generalising massively here, I know that. But I think the facade can, and probably should, operate as far more than just a smooth, transparent skin. It can become a communicative medium in its own right, and it certainly has been that in the past. One amazing aspect of living in an old city like London is the sheer depth of its history, which many of us love to explore. A huge amount has been written about it, but there are still gaps. And again, our imaginations can fill those gaps with stories. So just as walls, doors and windows can control how much we directly experience of what happens inside a building, so the facade can also reveal information about what has happened there before. I like to take photographs whenever I see these little traces. Sometimes they're quite subtle, like a filled-in archway. Sometimes they're amazingly brash, like these bold pipes set against the royal coat of arms. Sometimes they're endearingly pragmatic, like this little window cutting through the sign there. And with clues like these, we can cobble together stories. Okay, here's one of my own. So this is an extract from a poem called Three Friars. The grey friar showed us down a busy street. He stopped beneath a shop front sign. A plastic fascia screen, batten lights and back tray, screwed onto a frame with glass and golden lettering, fixed in turn to timber boards and coats of paint, layered names creaking in the rush. Oriental Fountain, Peter's Fish Place, Crook and Son, Bakers, Crook the Baker, 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 Candle Maker, Benedict for tallow. Many historic buildings have been altered and added to over time, and these modifications may often be read as a series of physical layers. William Morris described this as a distinctly pre-modern pattern in his manifesto for the Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, issued in 1877. To paraphrase the great man, if repairs or changes were needed, they were carried out in the fashion of the day. Every change, whatever history it destroyed, left history in the gap and was alive with the spirit of that time. This process is still going on, though, and buildings can express it in different ways. Materials can develop a patina of age, a mellowing of their appearance due to year after year of exposure to the elements. Gentle, regular maintenance helps guard against this mellowing from becoming decay, and new materials may often be required to fix problems. Some buildings can become dramatic records of art, technology, even warfare, encapsulating ideas of the ages in which these great changes occurred. And clearly, if we're interested in preserving and interrogating this record, conservation is a crucial activity. What heritage means and how it should be treated vary widely between different situations. And project-specific discussions about the application of conservation philosophy are some of the most interesting parts of my job. We're almost back to poetry here, though. I think many of you may well have had direct experience of just how irrational and esoteric these discussions can seem. At the heart of all of this are the notions of change and authenticity. And not surprisingly, they can excite very strong feelings. The whole cast, the whole theatre company probably want to say. English Heritage talks about constructive conservation and discusses the means by which each generation aspires to enrich the historic environment with considered change, offering the potential to enhance and add value to places, as well as generating the need to protect their established heritage values. The ways we can add value, in this sense, can be tiny. Subtle additions to animate and add interest to the street, like a little run of fire bells on Hampstead Road, or the ghostly presence of our founder Arup's head next to his famous bridge in Durham. They can literally cut right through, like Stanton Williams's elegant insertions at King's Cross Central, or provide the perfect toy box extension, as Caruso St John have done at the V&A Museum of Childhood. Above all, we need to be both honest to our own time and respectful of what has gone before. Authenticity is key. And Morris was a true fundamentalist about this. He hated what he saw as the feeble and lifeless forgery in the work of his contemporaries, who often tried to create a more perfect conception of what had been handed down to them. The west front of Salisbury Cathedral is a perfect example of this. The Victorian figures are beautiful, but they're just slightly too beautiful to be truly medieval. And restoration is still a very popular idea. And at the moment we can see two very interesting examples. Schemes for rebuilding the Crystal Palace, which burnt down in 1936, and the Euston Arch, which was famously demolished in 1961, I think the Euston Arch plans are particularly interesting. They're a good test for how you feel about authenticity for two reasons. Firstly, because when it was first built in 1837, it was already a historic recreation, an ancient Greek design. And secondly, because a lot of the stones from the original arch have now been found in a river in East London and might potentially be used for its reconstruction. I wrote a poem about this. And here's a short extract. To reset this proscenium in place, to raise a replicated replica with fluted pieces dredged up from the lee, demands that plaster paste nostalgia stick, though twice removed already. So I'm going to let you make your own minds up about the authenticity of this thing. One thing's for sure, rebuilding the arch would be a fantastic branding move for the new station, and would probably help to sell a few more handbags in the concourse. Anyway, I'm talking about architecture being a record of different historical ideas. Some buildings come preloaded with this kind of stuff, and I have the great privilege to be working on one of them, Stirling and Gowan's engineering building at the University of Leicester, which opened in 1963. Historian Mark Crinson has a really nice phrase for describing Stirling and Gowan's approach to design: the uses of nostalgia. The engineering building embodies ideas of context, of Leicester as a Victorian industrial centre, and progress, of new technology and engineering, guiding Britain to a bright post-war future. This building has a sense of decorative detail, and although it relies heavily on glass for its facade and roofs, the glazing close to the ground is entirely translucent. There's not a single view in or out. Mystery is one thing this building does very well indeed. The engineering building is rightly listed, and our project there is, again, a conservation challenge. But the main reason that the building is in such poor condition today is its lack of adaptability, partly in its taut, diagrammatic layout, and partly in its inflexible glass facade systems. But we're on the case. Here's our visual mock-up for a replacement roof. All right. But what about brand new buildings? I think we should design with resilience and adaptability in mind from the start. I'm not really talking about the high-tech flexibility of modular components, which can be slotted in and out as required. I'm talking about how easily our buildings, and particularly their facades, can absorb changes and continue to contribute to the ever-changing narrative of the city. We know some things about what the future has in store for us. Climate change, for instance, and ever tighter requirements for energy efficiency. Architecture will inevitably be shaped by these forces. But we can also factor in some features which will give our designs the best chance of aging gracefully and maintaining a lasting value in a wider civic context. And I'd like to propose a few methods for achieving this. Firstly, let's talk about materials. I've spoken already about the disconcerting effects of glass facades, but glass does obviously have a role to play. From the railway sheds and palm houses of the 19th century, we have a rich lineage of stunning glass structures, and that absolutely continues today. Displays behind glass panes can electrify the street with vivid colours and shapes. But we do need to bear in mind that these effects are transient. They come and go with the seasons and fashions and leave no lasting trace. Glass can't develop a patina, a texture of its own. It's a very important material, but it needs to be used in a balanced way. Thin cladding materials allow for a startling fluidity of form and finish and make dazzling wrapping. These panels are reliant on intricate supporting frameworks and are often built with quite short design lives. Any hard-won patina would easily be lost in a reclad. So detailing is everything. Aspects such as protection from water ingress and easy access for the maintenance of fixings and seals and so on can all be designed in and will help hugely in making systems which last. But to most fully embrace the notion of an evolving, layered city, we need durable materials which weather well and develop their rich, tactile surface over many years, which can be mended if they break, which can be fixed into, reshaped, and reconfigured without simply throwing them away. In some of our recent conservation projects, we have exploited the flexible potential of stone to an extreme extent on Piccadilly, where a Victorian facade was dismantled, lifted 1.5 meters and rebuilt. And also the repair work, which is still very comprehensive, at the Grand Hotel in Birmingham, where the facade has decayed to an astonishing extent, but has still been worked into to reinstate much of the original detail. Secondly, to build to the scale of the people outside. Buildings built tightly around the proportions of the human body can be compact, high density, rich in social integration and sensory stimulation. It is worth considering just how much we value the intimate proportions of medieval lanes, shambles, courtyards, cloisters, even literally what revenue can come from some of these places, and how resilient many have been despite such massive changes in technology and our way of life. Venice, perhaps the most unlikely, the most intensely theatrical of all of them, may yet have a future as a modern commercial city with high-speed broadband links across the lagoon. Contrast is important. We'll always have a thing for large, awe-inspiring monuments. But the power of these buildings lies not simply in their bulk. A small-scale human connection, often simply a detail sized around the hand of a craftsman, can draw us in and accentuate this impression of monumentality when it hits us. A sense of development, of dramatic progression, linking the building to our own experience and then accelerating away. Thirdly, I wonder if we can rediscover a sense of confidence in ornamentation. Our fragmented culture is never going to align itself again to a standard kit of ornamental parts. And I'm certainly not advocating a return to the ironic classical symbolism of the 1980s. There must be an opportunity, though, to explore the kind of pattern work prevalent in other aspects of contemporary design. I think we have a natural desire for decoration. What a shame if the buildings that we leave behind today show no marks of it. Done well, decoration on buildings can help them interact with their surroundings, provoke our imaginations, and provide real heritage currency for the future. We can learn many lessons from the past, and certain aspects of what might be called traditional design are worth revisiting. What I'm not talking about is pastiche or fakery. We've got to build as an art for our own time, but that might still mean drawing on sources from the past. So durable materials, a human scale, and confidence in decoration. As a facade designer and a conservationist, as a poet and as a citizen, what I'm most keen to propose is that we consider the street as a stage, with our buildings as scenery for the elaborate performance that we play out in front of them. Just as set design in theatres must correspond intimately to the proportions, movements and moods of the actors, so our facades should be designed in relation to the people who will walk past them. They should be capable of absorbing decay, accretions and modifications for many years to come, weathering the challenges our cities will face. In this way, I think we can make facades for the lasting benefit of the street and the city, a truly civic act. Thanks very much. Does anyone have any questions?
Okay, so I guess I'm doing a lot of work in Regent Street at the moment with the Crown Estate, and I walk up and down that street a lot. And as I guess you know, a lot of that Regent Street is being rebuilt currently, but all the facades that face Regent Street is being retained, most of which were built, you know, a little bit individually in the sort of early 20th century, and the whole series of different kind of styles there. So I guess my question is, if that street is a stage, are we as a nation a bit too reluctant to change the scenery?
Well, I mean, Regent Street is a very particular example as such a prominent historic street in the nation's capital. You know, there are certain sort of heritage assets which are always going to be a bit more difficult to change. But I think it's actually pretty impressive just how much Regent Street is changing. You know, you talk about the facades on Regent Street itself, but if you go around the little alleyways around it, all of a sudden, wow, you know, you're into this brand new stuff, sparkling facades. And I think that variety around that area and what the Crown Estate are doing there is a great credit to that street, that it can absorb these modifications. But I think we're a conservative people, yeah. But I think, I mean, in this slide you see just how beautifully, I think, modifications can be made, and getting that balance, and this is what I'm talking about with the balance of glazing, say, to stone and so on. I think the balance, there's a good balance being struck there.
Thank you for the very good talk. I agree with that last statement you say, because we work a lot in that field of architecture. But one of the areas that I find most surprising that nobody seems to pay so much attention to is the horizontal plane of the ground in the civic space. You mentioned so much. We spend virtually nothing on that space as a rule. We fill it with bollards and lampposts and
signs
or signage. It's a mess, and frequently that's an area which, if attended to, can really improve the civic space. I don't know what you can say about that.
I agree. I mean, I don't do much on floors, but no, yeah, absolutely. I think the textures of public space apply absolutely to the ground that we walk on as well. I suppose maybe because it takes such a pounding, it can be quite difficult to preserve, ornate pieces of craftsmanship and so on, especially in city centres where there's so much sort of through flow of traffic and all the rest of it. But I think we can learn a lot again from the urban design of the past. I think there's something there also about separation. So I know that Georgian squares, for example, have a sort of an elitism built into them, but there's something about separating spaces and having some areas that at least feel more exclusive and more protected and private, that can actually allow a more sophisticated approach to that space.
Well, very interesting. I think it's great that he went so far outside the normal box, and throwing poetry at us was just tremendous, and caught us all unaware at sort of 8 o'clock in the morning. We weren't expecting that. But very interesting, and it's very stimulating.
I thought the talk this morning was really inspiring, because we tend not to think about buildings in that sort of poetic way that Tom was putting it. I felt that we look at the facades of buildings, we walk past them, we don't see them, and yet it's always there for us. One of the things that I would like to develop with Tom later would be, do we change the scenery enough? We talked about it being a stage. The stage set changes so many times in a play and so many times in a year, yet we don't change the street scenes quite as much. Shops change, what we see through the windows change, but the actual set doesn't. So there's something there, I think, that we could develop further. But I thought the whole morning was really good, and thank you very much.
So Tom's talk today was hugely insightful and brought something slightly different to most of your talks, I thought, in that he obviously brought the poetry aspect to which I know is a personal passion of Tom's. So it added a kind of an extra depth to to the presentation, and obviously the subject being facades and the streets on the street scene. What was really inspiring about today's talk was how he applied kind of materiality, the context of in specific kind of materials in a number of different facades, ranging from large, monstrous kind of 1960s blocks up on the Hampstead Road to very elegant conservation projects on Regent Street, and applying that kind of thought process to the work that he does.